Okay, so in this module, we want to look at Indigenous research methods, thinking about how we can do research in a way which empowers Aboriginal knowledges and peoples. Okay, so we're thinking here around things like an Indigenous standpoint, around governance, around using processes like yarning, which I'll explain later in the lecture. What does cultural positioning and standpoint mean? How can we develop protocols that allow Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal country to be strengthened in the process of research? So, taken from the Aboriginal English term yarning, let's have a talk, let's have a yarn. Um, this is really a more culturally responsive way of learning about the perspectives of people in your research ecosystem. Okay, so if you think about a survey, that's often very impersonal. It's tick box. It often, just has like a scale. Do you agree with this statement? Might have the space for people to write things, but it's fairly limited. And a standard interview format, you often again have this box. You're constrained about the questions that you can ask. When you are yarning with people, you're kind of following the trail of what they find interesting. You're listening and you're thinking on the fly. You might gently direct it back towards, your topic, but you're also allowing people to say what's important to them. So instead of saying, could you tell me about a negative experience you had at school? And could you tell me about a positive experience you had at school? You would say rather, yeah, can you tell me about what school was like for you? And then the person can pick whether that's a kind of a negative, a positive, or even a kind of neutral position. And then you could follow that up by saying, yeah, that's really interesting. Could you tell me more about that? Or you might choose to direct the conversation back another way. One of the things that happens in yarning as well is that you're often, instead of just being the kind of impersonal interviewer, you might share a story back of your own. But you need to think really carefully about, what you want to share of yourself. But that gives you an insight into the kinds of decisions and discussions that the people that you are you have in your research group might also be feeling. So it's a really great and I think gentle way of eliciting knowledge from other people. So one method which has received quite a bit of positive attention comes from Dr. Miriam Rose Ungama, and she talks about her cultural notion of Didiri. And she says, Didiri recognises the deep spring that is in all of us. We call on it and it calls to us. This is the gift that Australia is thirsting for. When I experience Didiri, I am made whole again. I can sit on the riverbank, walk through the trees. Even if someone close to me has passed away, I can find peace in this silent awareness. There is no need for words. So Didiri is a way of deep listening, of being quiet and centered. And, a lot of people, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, working in research settings have found this, as a really useful means of approaching, in particular, difficult topics. So it's really important to note, though, that not only can Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge work side by side, they can also, work in a kind of a co-design process. And some Indigenous methods are constructed specifically to collaborate with Western knowledge. And that's really important when we consider some of the world's challenges like climate change and, things like water management and water quality. These are all things where Western and Indigenous science can go hand in hand. And I really liked the quote from the head of the Sami Council. So the Sami are the Indigenous peoples of that European kind of Arctic area. Yeah, and they talk about how neither Western science or traditional knowledge alone has the answers. So there's this kind of need to work together, which I think is a really useful model, particularly for us. So what would that mean? Well, we could use deep listening in or Didiri in a research cycle. So there's that kind of look and listen process, the think and discuss, and then the take action together. And this is sometimes, particularly in contexts in Northern Australia, used with the concept of gama, which is the idea of freshwater and saltwater meeting. And so if you think about that in terms of, ecosystems, it's a really interesting place because things have to be really adaptive to survive where fresh water meets salt. And so that's used as a method of how the knowledges can work together. And people think about ideas around, other kind of metaphors, ideas around things like weaving knowledges together. If you think about weaving, you've got distinct strands, you weave them together, they are still visibly different strands, but when you weave something together, you actually make it stronger. So even if you think about something like an individual hair is quite easy to break, but a woven braid, a woven rope, these are much, much stronger. So the use of metaphor in these kinds of methods is also pretty common. A method which has come out of Canada is the idea of two-eyed seeing. So when you look at a problem, you look at it through an Indigenous eye, an Indigenous lens, and you look at it through a Western knowledge system. And this was done really strongly to apply to looking at fisheries and how can waterways and different fish stocks be kept healthy. So having both an Indigenous and a Western perspective. And so two-eyed seeing is applied here in Australia, however, as well in research. And I've seen it in literature in other countries as well. So it's important to remember too that just as that kind of European founding fathers theory, went global, we can also see that Indigenous knowledges, are moving in a global sense across the academy, and that's often referred to as, part of a decolonising process. So I talked a few minutes ago about this idea of weaving knowledge and the importance of metaphor. And I know that sometimes, when these things are first presented, they seem a little bit strange. But in fact, a lot of the time when people have conversations in English, they're actually using metaphor. So I was trying to think of an example, and one of my kids played hockey, and they're a goalie, and one of the sets in hockey is a power corner. So that's a really high pressure situation for a goalie. And so in our family, if something's coming up for my daughter and it's going to be pressure, we're like, it's just a power corner. It's just a power corner. Hold your nerve. by the same token, in all the sports that the kids have done, my husband always said to them, you got to play past the whistle. You've got to run, you've got to aim to run past the line before you start to slow down. And so we use those kinds of metaphors. You might have a natural, a natural metaphor, things that because they're something that you've grown up with, you don't think of as actually being holders of your culture. So, you might like to think of a metaphor for how you approach your education or your work or any other kind of issue in life. And then that will sort of start to get you into that headspace of thinking about a metaphor for research and how you're going to approach it. So the final thing that I want to talk about is the idea of time. When sociology founding father Max Weber was writing about the Protestant work ethic and relating that to capitalism, he said that capitalism moved you from a society where you work to live to a society where you live to work. And that, I think was a really profound shift, because if you look at, a lot of kind of pre-industrial, pre-capitalism cultures, you didn't clock on and clock off. You worked for as long as was needed. So if it was farming time and it was time for bringing in the harvest, you expected to work really long days. But if it was your kind of European winter, you expected that, you would be inside with the leisure time, that you would have stores of food. So you didn't work 9 to 5. Okay? And that fitted really well with a lot of notions of Indigenous time. And this is sometimes seen as the difference between event time. What do we need to do at a particular time for a particular reason, or the idea of clock time. So, if you're given work to do in an office setting, you don't just do the work and then go home. You're meant to space that work out and be productive from 8:30 to 4:30 or 9 to 5. Okay, so it's important to remember that people value time in different ways. And so when you're working with Aboriginal communities, you need to be prepared for flexibility of timelines. And, sometimes people, see that if someone doesn't meet a deadline, it's a marker of disrespect or laziness or unprofessionalism. But in fact, this is often around a cultural element of it takes the time it needs to take. And that can be really difficult, in your standard kind of interview format. I have an hour for an interview, when in fact it might go shorter or it might go longer. It might need you to go away, give the person time to think about it and come back. People will expect that you're not just being what's called fly in, fly out. So you're not just coming in, taking the knowledge and going and never being seen again. There's an expectation of longevity, of building a relationship. And I think, that it's actually quite an exciting way to do work, because it allows you to build something that's really meaningful, for the people that you're researching with, as well as for you.